For years, this case was considered solved. The official story was simple. A man murdered his neighbor in a fit of rage. The police acted fast, the trial was quick, and the community was told justice had been served. But the truth? The truth was buried so deep that it took more than 20 years for it to crawl back into the light. And when it did, it revealed something far more disturbing than anyone was prepared for. It began on a quiet suburban street. Late evening, no storms, no power outages, just an ordinary night. Then, at 10:37 p.m., a scream ripped through the silence. It was sharp, panicked, and it didn't sound like one person. Neighbors reported hearing two voices, one male, one female, arguing just moments before. But by the time police arrived, there was only one body lying in the living room, and only one man still at the scene. He didn't resist arrest. In fact, he barely spoke. Witnesses recall that he looked almost relieved as he was led away in handcuffs. At trial, the prosecution painted him as a violent man who finally snapped. The jury didn't deliberate for long. Guilty. Life sentence. Case closed. But here's where the story starts to twist. 2 decades later, an archivist was cleaning out an evidence room scheduled for renovation. In the back, on a top shelf covered in dust, she found a box with no label. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, taken just hours before the murder. And in those photographs, the victim wasn't with the accused killer. She was with someone else. A man no one had ever mentioned in court. Someone who was clearly close to her, maybe too close. And then came the most chilling discovery, a letter, hidden under the stack of photos. It was written in a shaky hand, dated the day after the murder. The letter read like a confession, but not from the man who had been convicted. It came from someone who claimed to have been at the house that night, and to have seen everything. But that's not even the worst part. The handwriting was analyzed, and when investigators saw the results, everything stopped. The letter belonged to a local police officer. Not just any officer, the very detective who led the original investigation. Why would the lead detective hide evidence that pointed away from the man he helped convict? And who was the man in the photographs with the victim, smiling just hours before she was killed? This is where the case begins to unravel. Because once the archivist reported the discovery, more records started surfacing. Reports that had been misfiled, witness statements that never made it into the trial, even audio tapes of interviews that were supposedly lost. Each piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. The crime scene had been staged. Everything you thought you knew about this case is about to be torn apart. Because what investigators uncovered next didn't just point to a wrongful conviction, it pointed to a cover-up that reached higher than anyone imagined. And that's where the story takes an even darker turn. When the case was reopened, what investigators uncovered was worse than anyone expected. The mysterious man in the photographs was finally identified, a well-known businessman with deep connections to local politics. He was never questioned, never mentioned in court, and yet his fingerprints were found on a glass at the crime scene. This evidence had been hidden in the original police file, marked as not relevant. And then came the real shock. The officer who wrote the confession letter. He had died under suspicious circumstances just 6 months after the murder. Officially, it was ruled an accident, a car crash on a deserted road, but the timing raised too many questions. Why would a man who had confessed in writing be allowed to stay on duty for months after the crime, only to die before the trial even began? Investigators also uncovered testimony from a neighbor who had been ignored the first time around. She had seen 2 men leaving the victim's house that night, neither of them the man who went to prison. She remembered one of them wearing a police jacket. Her statement had been thrown out as unreliable. But that's not even the worst part. A series of phone records, discovered in a sealed file, revealed that calls were made between the victim's house and the police station just minutes before the murder. Those calls were erased from the official record during the initial investigation. Who were they calling? And why did those calls disappear? Everything you thought you knew about this case is gone now. The convicted man's lawyer filed for a retrial, and as the new hearings began, the entire town started to turn on itself. People who had once celebrated the conviction were now pointing fingers, accusing local officials of orchestrating a cover-up to protect someone powerful. And then came the final twist. DNA analysis, something that hadn't been available during the original trial, was run on the evidence collected that night. The results confirmed what some feared all along. The person who actually committed the murder wasn't the man in prison, and it wasn't the businessman in the photographs either. It was someone else entirely. Someone who had been there from the very beginning. The DNA matched a second police officer, the partner of the detective who led the case. Yes, the man sworn to uphold justice was the very one who carried out the crime. And for decades, he had walked free, promoted, respected, even celebrated in the very community where he had spilled blood. The truth has been buried for decades, but now it's finally coming to light. And what's coming next? It will shake everything you thought you knew, because this case is no longer just about one murder. It's about how far those in power will go to keep their secrets hidden.